Hello there, my name is Esther de las Casas, and I am the communications lead at Ment Abacus. This summer, Naumburg was one of the stops on our European tour, a city whose quiet streets and imposing cathedrals still whisper of a powerful past. And yes, before you ask, Dan isn't here today either. Today's excuse? He's translating a patent specification. Isn't that an awesome way to spend a Sunday? In today's episode of The Bigger Picture, we return there to follow in the footsteps of one of the most provocative thinkers in modern philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche. We'll explore why he called himself the philosopher of the hammer, how his vision of the Übermensch challenges inherited moral systems, and why the metaphorical journey from camel to lion to child still matters for anyone trying to build a life and a worldview of their own. Naumburg's cathedral rises quietly above the old town, a stone witness to the days when this was an important religious center in medieval Germany. For centuries, bishops wielded power here, shaping not just faith, but also politics and culture. But that world faded. The Reformation ended Naumburg's ecclesiastical role. Wars, shifting trade routes, and the rise of nearby Leipzig and Halle pushed it to the margins. By the time Friedrich Nietzsche grew up here in the 19th century, Naumburg was a quiet provincial garrison town, conservative, devout, and steeped in Lutheran tradition. Nietzsche's own horizon soon stretched beyond those narrow streets. After his father, a Lutheran pastor, died when he was 5, Nietzsche grew up in Naumburg with his mother and sister. Years later, he won a scholarship to the elite Landesschule Forta, known as Schulpforta, where he studied from 1858 to 1864. The school was housed in a former Cistercian monastery, and students were required to live on campus, immersed in a world of strict discipline, classical languages, and intellectual rigor. The experience was formative, but also confining, sharpening Nietzsche's sensitivity to the weight of tradition and authority. Dan and I actually walked from Naumburg to Schulpforta this summer. It's just about an hour's walk. God is dead. We have killed him. Often misunderstood, these words are not a celebration but a diagnosis. The metaphysical framework on which European civilization had rested was crumbling, and yet public morality still relied on those same, now unstable foundations. Naumburg itself, its cathedral intact but its power gone, became a fitting metaphor for this condition. Nietzsche's answer was not despair but transformation. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he described the possibility of a new kind of human being, the Übermensch. Humanity, he wrote, stands between animal and Übermensch, like a tightrope walker balancing above an abyss, always becoming, always striving. The Übermensch is the one who dares to create new values in a world where the old ones no longer hold. Even Nietzsche's style was revolutionary. He rejected the rigid academic tone of philosophy, writing instead in sharp aphorisms and poetic fragments designed to provoke, not lecture. With Zarathustra, he created something entirely new. Part scripture, part myth, part philosophical drama, because for Nietzsche, the form of thinking mattered as much as the thought itself. At the heart of this work lies one of Nietzsche's most powerful metaphors, the 3 metamorphoses of the spirit, the camel, the lion, and the child. The camel is the spirit that kneels and says, "Load me with the heaviest burden." It accepts duty, tradition, morality. It obeys without question. Most people, Nietzsche believed, remain camels for life, living by thou shalt without ever asking why. But transformation requires the spirit to become the lion. The lion roars no. It rebels against the dragon whose golden scales read, "Thou shalt." The lion destroys what no longer serves, clearing space for something new. But the lion alone cannot create. The final metamorphosis is the child, a symbol of innocence, creativity, and new beginnings. The child says yes, it plays, it imagines, it builds new values from within itself, not as a reaction to the past, but as an affirmation of life. These 3 figures are not moral judgments in the conventional sense, but Nietzsche did see them as a hierarchy of transformation. Each represents a necessary stage in the spirit's development: the camel, which bears and endures, the lion, which breaks and defies, and the child, which creates and begins anew. Nietzsche presents these metamorphoses as successive stages of self-overcoming, But personally, from today's perspective, I see them less as a ladder and possibly more as a dynamic interplay, often overlapping and shaping one another. At different points in life, we may find ourselves carrying burdens like the camel, defying boundaries like the lion, or creating like the child, sometimes even all at once. Nietzsche's advice is simple yet demanding. Most of us live too much as camels. To become who we truly are, we must learn to roar like lions and to create like children. That's why Nietzsche called himself the philosopher of the hammer, smashing illusions, dogmas, and inherited certainties. It is an act of scriptasphemy, the deliberate breaking of outdated scripts when they no longer serve life. The goal was never to replace one ideology with another, but to clear the ground so that new and competing scripts could emerge, scripts written by individuals, not imposed by collectives. Carl Gustav Jung engaged deeply with Nietzsche's work and dedicated an extended seminar series, 1934-1939, to analyzing Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He regarded the text not only as a philosophical work, but as a valuable document of the modern psyche confronting its own inner dynamics. In Jung's view, Nietzsche gave voice to forces that belong to the collective unconscious, fundamental psychological patterns that shape how individuals and cultures experience transformation. While Jung did not explicitly map Nietzsche's three metamorphoses, camel, lion, and child, onto specific archetypes, he noted striking parallels. These figures resonate with the recurrent roles that emerge across myth and psychology: the obedient bearer of tradition, the heroic challenger of authority, and the creative principle that brings something new into being. Such symbols, Jung argued, are not arbitrary literary devices, but expressions of enduring psychic structures. Jung also offered a critical interpretation. He believed that Nietzsche had not fully confronted or integrated his shadow, the unconscious, darker elements of the personality that must be acknowledged for psychological wholeness. This, Jung suggested, might help explain some of the tensions in Nietzsche's life and thought. However, this interpretation remains speculative and should be seen as one perspective among many. Modern scholarship generally attributes Nietzsche's collapse in 1889 to a serious physical illness rather than purely psychological causes. After Nietzsche's collapse, his sister Elizabeth took control of his legacy. She distorted his manuscripts, compiled fragments into new books, and reshaped his image to suit her worldview. One of those compilations, The Will to Power, was presented as a finished work. But in reality, it was a posthumous construction Nietzsche himself never completed or approved. Later, some of the most dangerous masters of scriptonomics twisted those distortions to serve their ideologies, the very fate Nietzsche had warned against. And in this, his warning about the herd proved prophetic. Even the most radical rebellion can be repurposed into dogma when individuals stop thinking for themselves. This is why Nietzsche called for the Umwertung aller Werte, the revaluation of all values. Not chaos, not nihilism, but a conscious rebuilding of one's moral foundations. The camel, the lion, and the child are not just metaphors, they are the inner tools for that work. Nietzsche's project was never to offer a Prêt-à-Porter philosophy. It was to challenge us to reject ready-made systems and build our own. As he wrote, quote, "For believe me, the secret for harvesting from existence, the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius. Send your ships into uncharted seas." Unquote. In a world where old gods fall and new colorful flags are always waiting to be waved, his call remains radical. Do not follow, create. Do not inherit, transform. And above all, do not just accept scripts. Write your own. And that was today's Bigger Picture episode. So what do we take away from Nietzsche's journey? And from our stop in Naumburg? That in a world where old certainties crumble and new ideologies compete for our attention, the real challenge is not to follow a ready-made script, but to write our own. Whether we're carrying the weight of the camel, roaring like the lion, or creating like the child, these forces are all part of us. And Nietzsche's point was simple but radical. Build your values consciously, not by inheritance, but by choice. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Bigger Picture. And who knows, maybe next time Dan will join us in person. Either way, we'll be here exploring the ideas that shape how we think, live, and create. And last but not least, remember, as Dan always says, learning isn't a trend. Structure still works. Square, not hip. Visit us at mentabacus.com.
Every story needs structure. Every mind needs a map. Mentabacus. Square, not hip.